Michigan, and specifically for us, rural health here in Michigan. And I am honored to have one of my good friends, a great colleague here with me, Brian Peters, Chief Executive Officer at Michigan Health and Hospital Association, affectionately called MHA. And Brian has been a guest of ours on the podcast. I believe this may be his first live event. Is that correct, Rachel?
Yes, it is. He was just on the podcast last week, in fact, and this is his first live with us.
So this is very exciting. We have a lot to talk about today. We're going to talk all about politics and religion. No, wait a minute. I guess not. We're going to talk about all things hospital related. What's happening in Michigan? You know, as our listeners are more curious about what's happening in the state of healthcare, I think we have an obligation as leaders to share with them some of the challenges, some of the opportunities, and some of the victories. And I'm going to talk about the victories a little bit myself. The work that Brian and his team is engaged in is phenomenal. And I want to talk about what has happened over the last program year. But before we get started, Brian, can you tell our listeners, we have folks that listen through outside of Hillsdale, outside of Michigan, throughout the country on the live platform. Talk a little bit about what does the MHA do? What do you represent? You have some pretty cool statistics. I think we're a unique position because just about every hospital, if not every hospital, has joined the MHA. So talk a little bit to our listeners about that.
Well, that's right, JJ. It's always great to be with you and Rachel as well. And, you're right. The Michigan Health and Hospital Association is very privileged to represent every hospital and every health system throughout the entire state of Michigan. And that puts us in a very elite company when you look across the country at the State Hospital Association field. We are very close partners with the American Hospital Association. As you mentioned, we're here at their annual summer leadership conference and really comparing notes and learning from our colleagues from throughout the country. And as you said, advocating for rural health, among other things. We really do have a great opportunity, I believe, to speak with the totality of the field in the MHA umbrella. And we take that responsibility and that opportunity very, very seriously and really enjoy every opportunity I have to talk about our issues.
Yeah, and Brian, it's, I think there's some similar themes that we're hearing throughout the AHA conference that we heard at the MHA conference, workforce. We're dealing with some issues of reimbursement, funding, sustainability of hospitals. And then you have, really on a micro level, you've got sustainability of rural hospitals, which is a whole different category. And several of the programs that you have fought for at the MHA, the OB stabilization, some of the work that you have been doing has really been to support and prop up those local hospitals. And it's been remarkable. We're going to talk about that in just a minute. Before we begin with that, really would just like for you to share an overview. We spent some time at the MHA conference going over, all right, here's what we've done in the last year. Here's what we look forward to in the new year. You want to talk a little bit about, what you see in the upcoming program year, and what are your goals and what challenges do you, feel that we're going to face as an industry?
Well, absolutely. And as you said, we just finished our annual meeting where we have a transition in terms of leadership on our board of trustees. Now, Dr. Julie Yarrow from ProMedica is our new board chair, and she will lead a retreat of our board of trustees coming up in just a couple of weeks. Yeah. Where the MHA board, and JJ, you've been a wonderful member of our board, you'll be part of this process, but we'll sit down for a couple of days and talk about the lay of the land and what we see coming forward in the year ahead in terms of our main challenges. And I would anticipate that many of those priorities that the board will articulate for the association are going to be carry forward items from this past program year. So you mentioned a few of them, but workforce certainly continues to be at the top of everyone's mind. Recruitment and retention of qualified caregivers, that is a high priority. Behavioral health. Certainly, we have a behavioral health crisis in the state of Michigan. We are not alone in that regard as you look across the country, of course. Viability, we honestly have to do everything we can every single day at the state and federal level to make sure that our hospitals have the financial resources that they so desperately need in order to continue providing access to care for all of our communities. And when you look at the challenge of health equity, we know that this is a long-term journey. We're very proud to be on that journey. And I imagine we'll continue to lift that up as a high priority as a board of trustees. And so those are just a few of the items at a 30,000 foot level, but happy to talk in depth, of course, about these issues because they're the issues that we live and breathe every single day at the MHA.
Every day. And we'll jump into that. But before we do that, Rachel, I'm going to let you take it over with a few questions yourself.
Yeah, so Brian, tell us a little bit about, you just kind of shared how the priorities for your strategic planning are identified. It's through that meeting and those conversations with the MHA Board of Trustees. But what does that planning process look like once those priorities have been defined for your program year? How do you and your team go about then working toward accomplishing the goals within those priorities?
Well, it's a great question, and I think we have a formula now that has proven to be successful for the last 10 years now. Since I came into the CEO role at MHA, we've always followed the same approach where every summer we pull together our entire board of trustees with our senior management team from the association as well. And we meet in a retreat setting where we have adequate time to really get into a depth of detail that you really can't attain in a relatively short meeting. And so we extend that meeting opportunity so that we can really get into the weeds on these issues. And the board, which is very diverse, I mean, we have rural representation, we have large urban systems, everything in between, and they can really lift up. These are the priorities for us. This is what we need from our association, not only in the public policy domain where we live and breathe in the courts and the legislature and the regulatory arena, but also outside of that public policy domain. How can we move the needle on all of these issues, working collaboratively with our business partners as well? So the board engages in that process. We develop what we call a strategic action plan. It's a very robust document that has goals and objectives that are very clear to the association team. We then take that strategic action plan, and I can tell you within just a few short weeks of that board retreat, we convene a MHA Vice President's retreat. And that's to allow our team to really noodle on these issues and how best we can address them. And what partnerships do we need to develop? What outside help do we need to engage in terms of consultants for a given issue? And then we work on the issues, and then at the end of the program year, at our annual meeting every June, that's when we report back, if you will, to the Board of Trustees on our progress. And as JJ alluded to at our annual meeting a few weeks ago, we were able to tell a very positive story about the success in achieving the objectives in that strategic action plan.
Significant amount of work, Rachel, around many issues that Brian and his team has really, engaged their team and engaged several other partners. And I think that's important to know. The partners that we talk about, the partners are the legislature. It's not just an issue of, Brian and his team working in silos. What they're doing is they have a whole arm that works in Lansing to engage our politicians, our elected officials, really to tell the story of each of us. And what's really important about MHA is they're not telling the story just of the big systems. It's true representation among all hospitals, critical access, hospitals with 12 beds, to what we call the mid-sized vital hospitals like Hillsdale, to the big systems at Corewell, you name it. And so they're representing all of those. And I will submit to you that that's a tough task. Because sometimes there are, I'm not going to say conflicts, but certainly there are discrepancies between how rural and how the big systems, approach how we do our business as it relates to the funding that we need. We are certainly surviving at times on shoestring budgets in rural, and when we're dealing with a population of 70% or greater as government payers, there's no commercial insurance that we have the luxury of going to the table and finding great reimbursement. And so it's very difficult. And so the programs that really prop us up is the work that, Adam and his team and Laura and all of them are working on, OB stabilization, some of those things, disproportionate share funding in which they help us with our federal leaders. And so it's not just in Lansing, it's in Washington, and it's back locally because Brian presents to hospital boards across the state of Michigan, and he's talking to them and he's educating boards about the challenges that we face here in Michigan. And so, Brian, I guess the question I would ask is, we certainly know that we're entering a new state budget here very soon. I don't think the governor signed yet, right?
She is expected to sign our state budget this Wednesday, as a matter of fact. So we anticipate her signing it and implementing all of those provisions effective October 1st, of course, the start of the new state fiscal year, and all very positive for our member hospitals and health systems.
All right, so let's talk about that a little bit. What does that mean, positive for hospitals? What does the budget look like what news do you have for hospitals, healthcare agencies?
Well, certainly year in and year out, we advocate for fair and adequate Medicaid funding. We know that we have a very significant Medicaid population in Michigan. For every single one of our hospitals, the Medicaid population is a very significant proportion of their patient base. It's a population we need to prioritize and make sure that they're getting access to quality care. And so in this budget, once again, the governor and the legislature, in a bipartisan fashion, have lifted up those priorities. And we have all of the components of the Medicaid budget that the MHA Board of Trustees have lifted up. You named a couple of them, the OB Stabilization Fund, the rural pool as well. Graduate medical education is critically important. All of those elements are fully funded in this budget that will start October 1st. And what I would say is a real priority and a win for access to care in the state of Michigan is a change in our provider tax program related to our ability to draw down federal matching funds through the federal government. And this is going to provide the ability for our hospitals to continue making sure we can recruit and retain qualified caregivers, invest in technology and equipment, and continue to provide quality care for all members of our communities. And so the budget really is a positive from our perspective.
Yeah, it is. And we anticipate, so the governor will sign Wednesday. We'll get to work, the MHA will, at really understanding, and I know that Adam and his team have already put their eyes on this. In fact, we were at our conference for the MHA this year, and that's when they worked until 3, 4 in the morning.
That's right.
To pass that budget, and then we started to receive information about some of the wins that we had in healthcare, including some wins back home for Hillsdale Hospital, which we'll talk about here in the near future. So it's exciting. I cannot stress enough the type of work that the MHA is doing, that when I say prop up, but really to sustain hospitals like ours. Now, Brian talked about, there's some changes in this and that. Those changes are life-altering changes for hospitals like ours. They are. I cannot stress enough the gratitude that our hospital, our Board of Trustees, and hospitals like mine in the state of Michigan have for the work that Brian and his team have engaged in over the course of the last year, program year and fiscal budget year. Really to make sure that hospitals like ours receive the funding to be able to provide the services and to at least somewhat break even on those services. Remember, Medicaid is paying at a far less rate than Medicare was paying, and it would not even cover, and for many years, would not even cover the cost of delivering those services. And Rachel, you and I have talked about no other industry could survive this type of reimbursement. And so having the MHA go forward and to go and to create channels for us to be able to have this funding, to be able, again, it's not a lottery. We didn't win the lottery. We're actually getting paid close to what it costs to provide the service. And so that is a game changer for Michigan hospitals. And that's been led by your team, but under the direction of Brian. He has a phenomenal group. And the good news about the work that's been done is that we can look at 1-2 years of additional sustainability for our rural hospitals that were struggling. Now, we were not. But some of my peers, with very little cash on hand, we're not in a great position. And we're looking at potential conversations about closure, about some type of partnerships or affiliations. And so for communities, that means a lot when you have those conversations, because we know our hospitals are either number one or number two employers in those respective regions. And when you lose your hospital, you lose all of your economic development. And the downward impact is that healthcare outcomes are far worse than if you have that hospital that is positioned there. If you lose that hospital because of transportation and some of those issues. So I know I've droned on and on and on, but bottom line, all of that is possible because of the work that this guy, Brian Peters, has engaged in as the leader. Now he'll say, "Oh no, it's all my staff," and his staff are great, but he sets that tone, and then his staff go to work at carrying that tone, that out, that mission and that vision, and setting the values for his organization. So Brian, on behalf of rural hospitals like Hillsdale, I want to say thank you for the advocacy that you put forth in this year's budget. It does mean a tremendous amount for our hospitals like Hillsdale, who can move forward now with our agenda, with our mission, with our vision, and with our values to make sure that we're giving great care to our community.
Well, JJ, I appreciate your kind words, and it's heartening to hear how impactful this work has been to Hillsdale and, as you said, our other members throughout the state. The truth of the matter is, and you said it, I am blessed to have an amazing team at the MHA and blessed to have an amazing board of trustees and an amazing membership that is committed and engaged. And that's really the key. I mean, if you are pulling in the same direction and everyone can align, that's where the magic happens in terms of successful outcomes in the advocacy arena. Now, the truth of the matter is all of the positive outcomes from this budget that we just negotiated, the governor is going to sign, as you said, that work starts over every year.
Every year.
And we can't take anything for granted because every budget process really does begin with a blank slate, if you will. At least that's the way we look at it. That we don't take anything for granted. We have to advocate why it is that we need each and every one of these important elements included in the budget because, things change in Washington, D.C. Mm-hmm. Things change in Lansing. We have term limits. There are all sorts of political headwinds that can change on a dime. And that's one of the reasons why we can never lose that vigilance in terms of telling our story, as you said, to our elected officials, making sure that everyone in our communities understand how vital the hospital is, not only as a provider of care, but also as an economic engine as well. That's a story that we just cannot tell often enough.
Agree.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So, Brian, let's talk a little bit about some of the issues that are most pressing in healthcare right now. And what that looks like in Michigan, as well as any insights that you guys are gleaning from the AHA conference that you're at. Cybersecurity, Friday's CrowdStrike incident, I believe, showed everyone how important cybersecurity is, not because that was a malicious event, but because if a malicious event were to have that level of impact, we would then be seeing how far-reaching those effects can be. So when it comes to cybersecurity and healthcare, what are some of the areas that we're looking at and focusing on and really trying to strengthen?
Well, this is an issue that certainly keeps me up at night. And for anyone who's been following closely and understands that healthcare is clearly the number one target globally for cyber criminals, I think those of us in the healthcare field really do need to be more vigilant than ever before. And we're very fortunate that the American Hospital Association has John Rigi leading their cybersecurity efforts. He's a former FBI agent with specialty in this domain, and he's here at the AHA conference. He's had the opportunity already to provide an update. While I will say this CrowdStrike incident, it's being used as an opportunity by cyber criminals. In other words, we have heard from some of our hospitals already that cyber criminals posing as support desk employees who are calling and reaching out to help you correct all of the the negative outcomes from this latest incident, that in fact they're looking to take full advantage of that. So lurking around every corner is a cyber criminal that is going to do their level best to expose our weak points. And for that reason, I think there's a couple of buckets that you have to consider when you talk about cybersecurity. The first bucket, if you will, is prevention. Are you doing everything you possibly can to prevent a successful cyber attack? And we know that the human element continues to be the number one consideration there. That's why we engage in phishing tests of our employees on a very regular basis, because email phishing is still the number one way that cyber criminals gain access to our system. So we have to make sure our staff are trained, number one, that we have all the protocols in place with our information technology systems. So that's one bucket. The other bucket is risk mitigation after the fact. If there's been a cyber attack, now do we have a game plan, just like we do if there was a mass shooting event in our community, or a fire, or a weather-related event? We all have disaster plans that tell us here's the steps we're going to follow to make sure we can continue providing care to our community. Well, we need to have exactly the same in place when it comes to these types of cyber events. Now, I think that's just mission critical. We have an opportunity through the association to facilitate and be of assistance to our members. We've been working with CyberForce Q, which is a globally recognized cybersecurity consulting organization. They helped us to set up an HSOC, which is a healthcare cybersecurity operations center right in the state of Michigan. We have a number of members who have engaged with the HSOC so that we can act as an early warning system when there is evidence that there is a new attack that is underway. We can act quickly to mitigate that, to shut down access, etc. But we also need to be sure that our elected officials at the state and national level, and this is where AHA has been a terrific partner with us as we're talking with the Michigan Attorney General and others back up in our home state. We need to make sure they treat us as partners, and when we are the victims of a crime, treat us as victims. Don't treat us as the bad guy.
That's right.
And we certainly have seen some evidence of that in the past. We want to make sure that they understand, hey, we're not the bad guys here.
Exactly.
We're the victims. We want to partner with law enforcement. We want to partner with our elected officials and make sure we can deal with this in an appropriate fashion.
Absolutely.
So long answer, Rachel, but you've lifted up just an incredibly important issue when it comes to cybersecurity.
Another one that we have talked about before on the podcast with you and with Adam from your team, and we might have even talked with Laura about it too in our episode from 2 weeks ago, but for Michigan in particular, is nurse staffing ratios. And I want to kind of, the way that I think about the nurse staffing ratios issue is that you're kind of putting a state legislator as the bouncer at the front of the hospital, telling us whether or not people can come in. Because whenever mandatory staffing ratios are implemented with the kind of challenges we have right now with workforce, with shortages of nurses and things like that, if we can't meet those ratios, essentially we would not be able to serve as many patients walking through the door. So can you talk a little bit about where are we at with nurse staffing ratios? What are we expecting in this next legislative year?
Well, I love that description, Rachel. I think that's truly spot on, because at the end of the day, what this issue is all about, and for those who are listening from other states outside of Michigan where there could very well be a similar legislative push, this is really about the idea of replacing the local wisdom and expertise of the nursing leaders and the hospital executive teams who have a window into the unique ebb and flow of patient care in their hospital, unit to unit, day to day, seasonality. They know the education level of not only their nursing staff, but the rest of the care delivery team as well. They know the technology that they may or may not have the ability to deploy. They know the acuity level of the patients they're serving, and they develop a nurse staffing protocol accordingly. So this legislation is really about replacing that localized expertise and wisdom with a one-size-fits-all cookie-cutter approach developed by, as you said, Rachel, those elected officials in Lansing. And I can tell you, whether it's nurse staffing ratios or just about any other issue, that is not the way to go about healthcare delivery and financing. What you want is to provide that local expertise and flexibility to the maximum degree possible. And this is just the antithesis of that. It is one of those ideas that may sound good on the surface, but when you really peel back the layers of the onion, you understand what devastating implications this would have for patient access. Because as you accurately said, once you are close to or at that legislatively prescribed level, the answer to the next patient showing up at the door who may need a vital screening, they may need a vital service in the emergency department would be, I'm sorry, there's no room at the inn. Mm-hmm. And in fact, that same story might be told for the hospital down the road as well. Right. And we're talking here about rural healthcare. That becomes increasingly problematic in rural communities in Michigan and in other states as well. Mm-hmm. When the next closest hospital or provider may be a very significant distance away. So this is just a really bad idea in our view. Fortunately, we have been able to tell that story and tell it effectively to our elected officials. They have chosen at this point in time to not hold any further hearings or votes on the issue, which is great. But we know that after the election this November, we're going to have a lame duck session to be determined just how wild and crazy that lame duck session is. But we certainly want to make sure that we continue telling that story and ensure that nothing moves in lame duck.
Right. And there are a lot of other strategies that can be employed to work on the issues of nursing burnout, staffing shortages, and I know the MHA and the Legislative Policy Panel, which I serve on, has been looking at a lot of those strategies, and we're hoping to get some of the organizations that are pushing the mandatory staffing ratios to link arms with us on these other strategies that could be very effective as well. So hopefully that will happen at some point. And then another one to talk about, I think, especially for rural and for us in Hillsdale, is 340B. Most recently, there was a court ruling that came down, I want to say a couple weeks ago, that was not great, not one of the things that we wanted to see. But can you talk a little bit about 340B on a national scale, but also here in Michigan?
Well, absolutely. And, if you rewind the clock, even as recently as 3 or 4 years ago, I would have told you that 340B was really exclusively a federal issue in the perspective of advocating with our members of Congress to protect and preserve 340B. Now, more recently, 340B has become a state level issue because in Michigan, and there's been activity in a number of other states as well, we have been engaging with our elected officials in the House and Senate, and certainly with the governor and her team as well, to say, here are some behaviors of the pharmaceutical manufacturers that we would like to protect our patients against. We want to make sure that, for example, contract pharmacy is not excluded from the 340B program because many of our hospitals utilize contract pharmacy for very good reasons. We want to make sure that those providers have the ability to achieve full access for everyone in their respective communities, regardless of their ability to pay. And that's what 340B really helps us to do, particularly in a time where prescription drug costs have been exploding significantly beyond the medical CPI, Consumer Price Index, and certainly far above the general Consumer Price Index as well. And so we know that that's putting a burden on families. 340B is one of those ways that we can help to mitigate that by ensuring that there is access to affordable prescription drugs for everyone in our communities. Now, I mentioned our advocacy with Congress and our advocacy in the state with the legislature. The reality is now we are advocating in the courts as well. And we did have, about a year ago, a unanimous ruling by the Supreme Court of the United States in a case in which we were one of the amicus parties, along with some of our colleagues and the other state associations, and certainly with the American Hospital Association as well. They've been a tremendous partner in this regard. But that particular case was all about challenging what we believed was an inappropriate and unlawful move by the federal government, HHS in particular, the Health and Human Services Department, related to 340B. And we stood tall and challenged that on behalf of our members, and we prevailed. And it just, I think, lifts up the reality that when you talk about associations and you talk about our ability to engage in the public policy realm, you can never discount the courts as one of those important places where we can engage. And we've learned that lesson, I think, in the past when it comes to medical liability reform, that not everything happens, not all of the action happens in state capitol buildings or in the halls of Congress. Sometimes the action, if you will, is in the courts, whether that's the Supreme Court, whether that's in the appellate courts or state Supreme Courts. And we are very engaged in all of those settings.
And again, the most critical of all is the fact that we're represented, because I cannot go, to the Supreme Court and argue. So having associations that join, those type of suits is very, very impactful for hospitals like Hillsdale and other hospitals throughout Michigan, where our voice is elevated through MHA. And for those states listening who have not, those hospitals in states that are not Michigan, who have not joined their association, we would encourage you, talk to your associations. What you get is this, a glorious relationship in which you're well represented. And the pennies, literally, that we pay for the work that's being done by the MHA is well worth our investment. And so we're very thankful for that work that's been done in those areas. Rachel, before we open it up for questions today, I do have one last question for Brian. So, we've talked about the legislature, we've talked about the work that MHA does, we've talked about the work that each member and board member does. But Brian, let's talk to the communities right now, communities in Michigan that are listening. What can they do? What would you give the general citizen who's out there, the patient, who's really worried about access, who's worried about cost of healthcare? What would you say to our Michigan communities, and what would you say, they can do to help advocate for hospitals like Hillsdale or in their respective jurisdiction, their quote home hospital? What can they do, Brian? Are they powerless? What's their option?
My view is that every single resident of the state of Michigan, and this is true in other states as well, you have more ability to impact the outcome from our political and public discourse, public policy discourse, than you probably imagine. We have a saying at the MHA that politics is not a spectator sport. It's very easy for us to turn on the TV or surf the internet and look at all of the breaking news in the political domain. Mm-hmm. And certainly there's been a lot of that here in the last week or so. But instead of getting caught up in all of that as an observer, you really do need to get engaged. And there are multiple ways to do that. Certainly, you can reach out in a number of ways to your local elected official. And that might include your state House member, your state senator, your member of Congress, your United States senator. Mm-hmm. I will tell you, they will do their very best to listen and to respond. You can call, text, email, but you can also pay them a visit. They typically have, in our case, an office both in Lansing, but also in their home district. They have staff that is well qualified and trained to listen to their constituents. Mm-hmm. But really, it's helpful if you are someone that's concerned about healthcare. There's strength in numbers. That's what the association is all about. Mm-hmm. So to that end, we have on our website, www.mha.org, it's very easy to find our My Care Champion program. And this is a way that you can connect very clearly with your local elected officials. You can see all of the data and talking points that you might want to see from a healthcare perspective that can help you to tell your story. We always say data is important, but the anecdotal stories are equally important as well when you're connecting with lawmakers. And then lastly, for hospital and health system leaders, we say this all the time: invite your elected officials to your facility. Have them tour the hospital. have them talk with your staff.
Mhm.
That's really the best way for them to see firsthand, these are the challenges that we're dealing with, and this is why our hospital deserves all of our support. So these are just a few of the ways to get engaged. Last but not least, it's an election year. Get out and
Get out
vote.
and vote.
You have to get out and vote.
Absolutely. Critical. Brian, it's always a pleasure to be with you. We are going to open it up if there are any questions, but I cannot stress enough the relationship that the MHA plays with hospitals like ours. I cannot stress enough how well that works for our communities and drives resources back to Hillsdale. And whether it's financial resources, whether it's a conference we attend, whether it's the committees that Rachel, myself, John Robertson, a group of us serve on various committees to really advocate and elevate rural health in Michigan. So thank you for allowing us the opportunity to do that. Thank you for leading, and thank you for such an amazing team of employees that, team members up at MHA that really every day pour their heart, their soul, and their mind into this job. And I mean it. You will not find a more dedicated group of talented individuals than are at the Michigan Hospital Association. I don't say that, just because you're here. I say it everywhere I go. I tell my board of trustees that. I tell my senior leadership that. It is truly remarkable to see the work that you and your team have done. So, Brian, thank you on behalf of hospitals like Hillsdale for that work.
Oh, thank you, JJ. Thank you, Rachel. Truly, this is a partnership, and we value that partnership. And we live our mission. We advance the health of individuals and communities. I can tell you that's what motivates me. It's what motivates our MHA team. And we're just so blessed to have this partnership with you and your colleagues. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you,
Rachel.
Brian. And we don't have any questions today, but I do just want to let our viewers know that if you want to hear more from the Michigan Hospital Association, more conversations like this, if you go check out our podcast feed, Rural Health Rising, wherever you get your podcasts, or ruralhealthrising.com, we have several episodes with Brian and members of his team talking about various issues related to healthcare here in Michigan, but also those things often have national implications or factors as well. So be sure to go check those out. And also you can check out the MHA podcast as well. So just go to their website at mha.org and you can find their podcast information there because they have a show also. So to close today, we do want to thank you, our community, for your continued support. If you want to connect with us more, we've put everything on one page now. So you can visit hillsdalehospital.com/live for several different ways to engage with us. You can nominate a hospital staff member for our quarterly patient care award. You can support our capital fundraising campaign, learn about volunteer opportunities, and also if you are maybe looking for a career change or you are looking for an organizational change, consider joining an award-winning workplace in the healthcare industry. That information is also available at hillsdalehospital.com/live. You can see our current openings. Catch us on WCSR on Fridays and Buzz Online on Saturdays for our radio updates. And don't forget, as I already mentioned, to check out our national podcast, Rural Health Rising, at ruralhealthrising.com, or subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. So we will see you here again next time. And until then, stay safe, stay healthy, stay Hillsdale strong, and choose Hillsdale first.